Hello everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, The English Globe. I hope you all are doing great today. And let me begin with a powerful image that is shaping global headlines right now. Because imagine a moment where tensions in the Middle East are rising again, where military movements, political statements, and economic pressures are all happening at the same time. And where one major decision from a global leader could influence not just one region, but the entire world. And in this complex situation, the focus suddenly turns to Donald Trump, a leader known for strong and direct policies, especially when it comes to dealing with countries like Iran. And what makes this moment even more interesting is not just his position, but the reaction of his traditional allies, because instead of immediate support, we see hesitation, caution, and, in some cases, clear distance. Which raises a very important and serious question that we will explore in today's episode, and that question is simple but deeply important. Is Trump standing alone? And why are NATO allies refusing to join this conflict?
Yes, Adam. And I think this question is not only important for people who follow politics closely, but also for English learners who want to understand how global events are connected and how decisions made by powerful countries can influence the entire international system, because when we talk about a possible conflict involving the United States and Iran, we are not just talking about two countries disagreeing with each other, but about a situation that could affect global security, energy markets, international trade, and diplomatic relations. And what makes this situation even more complex is the role of NATO, which is one of the most powerful military alliances in the world. And historically, this alliance has often acted together in times of crisis. But today we are seeing something different, something more cautious, and more divided, which makes people wonder why this time is not the same as before.
That is exactly the point, Julia, because when people hear about NATO, they often think of unity, strength, and collective action, especially because this alliance was created to ensure that its members support each other in times of danger. And for many years, it has represented a strong partnership between countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. But what we are witnessing today challenges that image. Because despite rising tensions and strong words coming from Washington, many NATO countries are choosing a different path, one that focuses more on diplomacy, caution, and avoiding escalation. And this creates a situation where the United States appears more isolated than expected, especially when compared to past conflicts where allies quickly came together.
And I believe, Adam, that this is where the topic becomes truly interesting and meaningful, because it shows us that international relations are not always simple or predictable, and even strong alliances like NATO do not automatically act in the same way in every situation. Because each country has its own interests, its own political priorities, and its own concerns about the risks involved in any conflict. And when it comes to Iran, many European countries are thinking carefully about the consequences of military action, including the possibility of a larger regional war, economic instability, and long-term security challenges, which is why their response is more cautious and more measured than what some might expect.
Absolutely. And this is why in today's episode, we are not just going to describe what is happening, but we are going to analyze it step by step in a clear and simple way, so that every listener can understand the deeper reasons behind these decisions. Because on the surface, it might look like a disagreement between allies, but when we look closer, we see a combination of political strategy, military risk, economic interests, and diplomatic calculations, all coming together to shape the actions of different countries. And in my opinion, what makes this situation unique is that it reflects a changing world, where alliances are still important, but they are no longer as automatic or predictable as they once were.
I completely agree, Adam, and I would also like to highlight that understanding this topic can help our listeners develop a more global perspective, because instead of seeing events as isolated or simple, they can begin to recognize how different factors are connected and how decisions made in one part of the world can have effects in many other regions. And when we talk about a possible conflict involving Iran and the United States, we are also talking about energy routes, global markets, regional stability, and international diplomacy, which means that this is not just a political story, but a global story that affects millions of people in different ways.
Yes, Julia, and that brings us back to the central idea of this episode. Because what we are really exploring is not just whether NATO is supporting the United States or not, but why this situation is different and what it tells us about the future of global cooperation. Because in the past, alliances often acted quickly and together. But today we are seeing more independent decision-making, more careful analysis, and sometimes even disagreement among close partners, which suggests that the world is becoming more complex and more balanced in terms of power and influence.
And that is why, as we continue this discussion, we want our listeners to think deeply about the question we introduced at the beginning, because it is not only about one leader or one conflict, but about the nature of international relationships in the modern world, and whether strong alliances like NATO will continue to act as unified forces, or whether they will become more flexible and selective in their decisions, depending on the situation and the risks involved. And by the end of this episode, our goal is to help you understand these dynamics in a clear and meaningful way.
So as we move forward, keep this key question in your mind, because it will guide everything we discuss in this episode. And that question is, why are NATO allies choosing not to fully support the United States in this situation involving Iran? And what does this decision reveal about global politics, leadership, and the future of international cooperation? Because sometimes the most important stories are not about what is happening on the surface, but about the deeper reasons behind those events. And today, we are going to explore those reasons together in a simple, clear, and engaging way.
And with that thought, let us continue this journey of understanding, because what we are about to explore is not just a headline or a temporary situation, but a reflection of how the modern world works, where power, strategy, and cooperation are constantly evolving, and where even the strongest leaders may find themselves facing challenges that cannot be solved alone, which makes this topic both fascinating and essential for anyone who wants to understand global events with clarity and confidence.
To truly understand why some countries hesitate to join a conflict, we first need to clearly understand what NATO actually is, because many people hear this name in the news, but do not fully understand how it works or what its real purpose is. And in simple terms, NATO is a military alliance created after World War II with one main goal, which is to protect its member countries from external threats. And this means that instead of each country standing alone in times of danger, they agree to stand together as a group, creating a system of shared security where an attack on one member is treated as a serious concern for all members. And this idea was especially important during times of global tension when countries needed strong partnerships to ensure stability and peace.
Yes, Adam. And what makes NATO unique is that it is not just a political agreement, but a structured alliance with clear commitments, shared planning, and coordinated military capabilities, which means that member countries do not only promise to support each other, but also work together through joint exercises, strategic discussions, and long-term planning. And this creates a level of cooperation that goes beyond simple friendship between nations, because it involves real preparation for possible threats. And countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany play leading roles in this alliance due to their military strength, economic power, and global influence, which is why their decisions carry significant weight in any NATO-related situation.
Exactly, Julia. And at the heart of NATO's structure is one of its most important principles, known as Article 5, which is often described as the foundation of the entire alliance, because it clearly states that if one member country is attacked, it will be considered an attack against all members. And this principle creates a powerful sense of unity and deterrence, meaning that potential enemies are less likely to attack a NATO country because they know it could lead to a response from multiple nations, not just one. And this idea has helped maintain stability in many regions by reducing the chances of direct conflict, as it sends a strong message that NATO members are not isolated, but part of a larger protective system.
However, Adam, it is also very important to understand that Article 5 is not automatically activated in every situation. because the definition of an attack can sometimes be complex and open to interpretation. And NATO members must agree that a situation truly qualifies as a direct threat to one of their countries before they take collective action, which means that not every conflict involving a member country will lead to a full NATO response. And this is a key point that many people misunderstand because they assume that NATO will always act together in any crisis, while in reality, decisions are made carefully and based on specific conditions, legal interpretations, and political agreement among all members.
That is a very important clarification, Julia, because it helps us understand why NATO does not always respond in the same way to every global situation. And in fact, there have been many cases where individual NATO countries acted independently rather than as part of the full alliance, especially in conflicts that were not directly linked to an attack on a member state. And this shows that while NATO provides a strong framework for cooperation, it does not remove the independence of its members, as each country still has the right to make its own decisions based on its national interests, political priorities, and assessment of risks.
And this balance between unity and independence is what makes NATO both strong and sometimes complex, because on one hand, it allows countries to work together and present a united front when necessary. But on the other hand, it also means that reaching a common decision can take time, discussion, and compromise, especially when member countries have different perspectives or concerns about a specific issue. And in situations involving regions like the Middle East, these differences can become more visible because countries may have varying levels of involvement, different economic interests, and different views on how to manage risks and maintain stability.
Yes, Julia, and this brings us to another important point, which is that NATO is primarily a defensive alliance, not an offensive one, meaning that its main purpose is to protect its members rather than to start or join conflicts that are not directly related to their security. And this distinction is very important when analyzing situations like tensions with Iran. Because if a conflict is not seen as a direct attack on a NATO member, then the alliance may choose not to act collectively, and instead, individual countries may decide their own level of involvement, which can result in a situation where the alliance as a whole appears less unified.
I think that is a key idea for our listeners to understand, because it explains why NATO's response can sometimes seem slow or limited, even in situations that appear serious or urgent. And it also highlights the importance of political agreement within the alliance, because decisions are not made by one country alone, but require discussion and consensus among multiple governments, each with its own priorities and concerns. And this process can lead to careful and measured responses rather than immediate action, especially when the risks of escalation are high.
Absolutely, and when we connect all these points together, we begin to see a clearer picture of how NATO works in reality, not just in theory, because while it is a powerful alliance with strong commitments, it is also a system that depends on cooperation, agreement, and shared understanding among its members. And this means that its actions are influenced not only by military considerations, but also by political decisions, economic interests, and strategic calculations, which makes it a dynamic and sometimes complex organization to analyze.
And this understanding is essential as we continue our discussion, because now that we know what NATO is and how it operates, we can better explore why its members might choose not to act together in certain situations, and why decisions that seem surprising at first may actually be the result of careful analysis and strategic thinking. And as we move forward, we will use this foundation to examine the current situation in more detail, helping our listeners see not just what is happening, but why it is happening in the way that it is.
Now that we understand how alliances like NATO function, it is time to look closely at the conflict itself, because to answer our main question, we must first understand what is actually happening between the United States and Iran. And at first glance, it may seem like a sudden crisis. But in reality, this tension has been building for many years, shaped by deep political mistrust, strategic rivalry, and repeated disagreements over security and influence. And in recent months, the situation has become even more serious, with military actions, strong political statements, and rising regional instability, all contributing to a dangerous environment where even a small escalation could lead to a much larger conflict.
Yes, Adam. And one of the most important issues at the center of this tension is Iran's nuclear program, because the United States and several of its allies have long expressed concern that Iran could develop nuclear weapons, while Iran has consistently stated that its nuclear activities are for peaceful purposes, such as energy production. And this disagreement has created years of negotiations, agreements, and disagreements, including the well-known nuclear deal that attempted to limit Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for economic relief. But after that agreement collapsed, tensions increased again, leading to new sanctions, new political pressure, and a growing lack of trust between both sides.
And this brings us to another major factor in this conflict, which is economic pressure, because the United States has used strong sanctions as a tool to limit Iran's economy, especially targeting its oil exports, banking system, and international trade. And these sanctions have had a significant impact on Iran's economy, creating financial challenges and increasing internal pressure. But at the same time, they have also increased tensions because Iran views these measures as unfair and aggressive, while the United States sees them as necessary to control what it considers a security threat. And this cycle of pressure and response has made the situation more complicated and more difficult to resolve.
And beyond nuclear issues and sanctions, Adam, there is also the question of regional influence, which plays a very important role in this conflict, because Iran has built strong connections with different groups and governments across the Middle East, creating a network of influence that extends beyond its borders. And from the perspective of the United States, this influence is seen as a challenge to regional stability and to its own strategic interests, while from Iran's perspective, it is seen as a way to protect its position and maintain its security in a complex and often unstable region. And this difference in perspective adds another layer of tension to an already complicated situation.
Exactly, and when we look at recent developments, we can see how quickly this situation has escalated. Because military actions, including strikes on key facilities and retaliatory responses, have increased the level of risk significantly, and reports show that attacks on infrastructure and strategic locations have already taken place, leading to serious consequences not only for the countries directly involved, but also for the wider region. And what makes this even more concerning is that these actions are not happening in isolation, but are part of a larger pattern of escalation that could continue if diplomatic solutions are not found.
And one of the most critical aspects of this situation is its global impact. Because this is not just a regional issue limited to the Middle East, but a situation that affects the entire world, especially when we consider the importance of energy supply, because the region plays a key role in global oil and gas production. And when tensions rise or conflicts disrupt production and transportation, the effects can be felt worldwide through higher energy prices, economic uncertainty, and market instability. And recent events have already shown how quickly energy markets can react, with oil prices rising sharply due to fears of disruption.
Yes, Julia, and this is where the strategic importance of locations like the Strait of Hormuz becomes very clear, because this narrow passage is one of the most important routes for global energy transportation, with a significant percentage of the world's oil passing through it every day. And when tensions increase in this area, shipping routes can be disrupted, trade can slow down, and global markets can become unstable. And in the current situation, there have already been disruptions and security concerns affecting ships and energy flow, which shows how quickly a regional conflict can turn into a global economic issue.
And we should also consider the broader security risks, because when tensions rise between powerful countries, there is always the possibility that other nations or groups may become involved, either directly or indirectly, which can expand the conflict beyond its original scope. And in the Middle East, where many countries have their own interests and alliances, this risk becomes even greater, because a conflict between the United States and Iran could influence neighboring countries, regional stability, and even global security structures, which is why many governments are calling for caution and diplomatic solutions rather than further escalation.
Absolutely. And what makes this situation particularly sensitive is that it combines multiple risks at the same time, including military confrontation, economic disruption, and political instability, all happening in a region that is already complex and strategically important. And this combination makes it difficult for countries to make quick decisions, because any action could have serious and long-lasting consequences, not only for the countries directly involved, but for the global system as a whole. And this is one of the key reasons why many international actors are choosing to respond carefully rather than aggressively.
And this brings us back to the main idea that we must keep in mind as we continue this episode. Because the conflict between the United States and Iran is not just about one issue or one moment, but about a combination of historical tensions, strategic interests, and current events that are all connected. And understanding this complexity helps us see why the situation is so sensitive, why the risks are so high, and why different countries, including NATO members, are approaching it with caution, analysis, and sometimes hesitation, which is exactly what we will explore in the next part of our discussion.
When we look at the current tension with Iran, it becomes very important to understand the strategy behind the decisions coming from Donald Trump, because without understanding his approach, it is difficult to explain why this situation has developed in such a strong and direct way. And one of the most commonly used terms to describe his policy is maximum pressure, which refers to a strategy that focuses on applying strong economic, political, and sometimes military pressure in order to force changes in another country's behavior. And in this case, the goal has been to limit Iran's nuclear ambitions, reduce its regional influence, and push it toward negotiations under conditions set by the United States. And this approach is very different from slow diplomacy, because it aims to create immediate impact rather than gradual change.
Yes, Adam. And when we talk about maximum pressure, one of the most visible tools used in this strategy is economic sanctions, which have been applied in a very strict and wide-reaching way, targeting key parts of Iran's economy such as oil exports, banking systems, and international trade connections. And these sanctions are designed to reduce Iran's financial resources, making it more difficult for the country to fund its programs and maintain its regional activities. But at the same time, these measures also increase tension, because they are seen by Iran as a form of economic warfare. And this creates a situation where pressure leads to resistance, and resistance leads to even more pressure, forming a cycle that is difficult to break.
Exactly, Julia. And in addition to economic measures, there is also a clear element of military signaling in this strategy, because strong warnings, increased military presence, and strategic positioning are used to show that the United States is prepared to act if necessary. And while these actions do not always lead to direct conflict, they send a powerful message intended to influence decision-making on the other side. And this combination of economic pressure and military readiness is what defines the overall structure of the strategy, as it uses both financial and security tools to achieve political goals, creating a situation where the pressure is felt on multiple levels at the same time.
And what makes this approach even more interesting, Adam, is the role of domestic politics, because decisions in foreign policy are often influenced by internal factors within a country, and in the case of the United States, political leadership must consider public opinion, political support, and national priorities when making major decisions, and strong policies can sometimes be used to demonstrate leadership, show determination, and respond to concerns about national security, which means that foreign policy is not only about international relations, but also about internal political dynamics. And this connection between domestic and international factors helps explain why certain strategies are chosen over others.
That is a very important point, Julia, because it shows that strategy is not created in isolation, but is shaped by multiple influences. And when we compare this approach to previous administrations in the United States, we can see clear differences in style and method, because earlier strategies often focused more on diplomacy, negotiations, and multilateral agreements involving multiple countries. While this approach places greater emphasis on direct action, unilateral decisions, and strong pressure tactics, and this shift represents a different way of thinking about how to achieve international goals, one that prioritizes speed and impact over gradual cooperation.
And I think it is also important to note, Adam, that this difference in approach has a direct impact on relationships with allies. Because when a country chooses a more independent and forceful strategy, it may not always align with the preferences of its partners, especially those who prefer diplomatic solutions and long-term negotiations. And this can create tension not only with the country being targeted, but also within alliances, as different members may have different views on how to handle the situation, which is exactly what we are seeing in the current context.
Yes, Julia, and this is where the concept of power becomes central to the discussion, because the strategy we are describing relies heavily on the idea that strong pressure can lead to desired outcomes. And while this can sometimes be effective, it also carries risks because too much pressure can lead to resistance, escalation, or unintended consequences, especially in a complex region like the Middle East, where multiple factors are always interacting at the same time, and this means that every decision must be carefully considered, as the results may not always be predictable.
I completely agree, and I would add that this strategy also reflects a broader shift in how global power is used. Because instead of relying mainly on cooperation and agreements, we are seeing more emphasis on competition, influence, and strategic pressure, which creates a different kind of international environment, one where countries must constantly adapt to changing conditions and respond to new challenges. And in this environment, decisions are often made quickly and with a focus on immediate impact, rather than long-term stability alone.
And when we bring all these elements together, we can better understand why this approach has created both strong reactions and significant debate. Because while it aims to achieve clear goals, it also raises important questions about effectiveness, risk, and global cooperation. And these questions are not only relevant for the countries directly involved, but also for allies, partners, and the international community as a whole, as they must decide how to respond to this strategy and what role they want to play in the situation.
And this is exactly why understanding this strategy is so important for our discussion, because it helps explain not only the actions of the United States, but also the reactions of other countries, including members of NATO, who may see the situation differently and choose different paths based on their own priorities and concerns. And as we continue, we will explore how these differences in perspective are shaping the overall response to the conflict, helping us answer the central question of why this situation is unfolding in such a unique and complex way.
Now we arrive at the most important question of this entire discussion, because after understanding the conflict, the strategy, and the global risks, we must ask why NATO is not fully supporting military involvement in this situation. And at first glance, this may seem surprising, especially considering the strong alliance between its members. But when we look deeper, we begin to see that this decision is not based on weakness or disagreement alone, but on a careful evaluation of risk, responsibility, and long-term consequences. And one of the main reasons behind this hesitation is that many NATO countries are simply reluctant to engage in another military conflict, particularly in a region as complex and sensitive as the Middle East, where past experiences have shown how difficult it can be to achieve stable and lasting outcomes.
Yes, Adam. And this reluctance is strongly connected to the core purpose of NATO itself. Because as we discussed earlier, NATO is fundamentally a defensive alliance, which means its primary role is to protect its members from direct attacks rather than to participate in conflicts that are not directly linked to its own security. And in the current situation involving Iran, there has been no clear and direct attack on a NATO member that would automatically require a collective military response. And this brings us back to the importance of Article 5, which is the principle that defines when NATO acts together. Because without a direct attack that meets this condition, there is no automatic obligation for all members to join military action.
Exactly, Julia. And this legal and strategic framework plays a very important role in shaping decisions, because it gives NATO members a clear guideline for when collective action is necessary and when it is optional, and in this case, the absence of a direct attack means that each country has more freedom to decide its own response, which leads to a situation where some countries may support diplomatic efforts, others may provide limited assistance, and many choose not to engage militarily at all. And this flexibility is part of how NATO operates, but it can also create the appearance of division, especially when expectations of unity are high.
And beyond the legal framework, Adam, there is also a very strong concern about escalation. Because one of the biggest risks in this situation is that a limited conflict could quickly grow into a much larger war, involving multiple countries and creating widespread instability. And for many European nations, the possibility of such an escalation is a major reason for caution, because they understand that once a conflict begins, it can be very difficult to control or contain, especially in a region where many different actors are already involved. And this fear of a wider war is not just a theoretical concern, but a realistic scenario that policymakers take very seriously when making decisions.
Yes, Julia, and this concern becomes even more important when we consider the potential global consequences of such an escalation. Because a larger conflict in the Middle East could affect energy supplies, international trade, and global security, creating challenges that go far beyond the region itself. And NATO members are very aware of these risks, which is why they are carefully weighing the potential outcomes of any military involvement. And in many cases, they conclude that the risks of escalation may be greater than the potential benefits of immediate action, leading them to choose a more cautious approach.
I completely agree, and I would also add that differences in political priorities among NATO members play a significant role in shaping their responses, because each country has its own national interests, economic connections, and domestic concerns which influence how it views the situation. And for example, some countries may prioritize stability and diplomacy, while others may focus more on security and deterrence. And these different perspectives can lead to different decisions, even within the same alliance, which shows that NATO is not a single unified voice, but a group of countries working together while still maintaining their independence.
That is a very important point, Julia, because it highlights the complexity of modern alliances, where cooperation exists alongside diversity of opinion. And in the case of the United States, its approach under Donald Trump may not fully align with the preferences of other members such as Germany or France, which often emphasize diplomacy and long-term stability. And this difference in approach can create tension within the alliance, not because the partnership is weak, but because each member is responding based on its own strategic calculations and priorities.
And this situation also reflects a broader trend in international relations, where countries are becoming more careful and selective about military involvement, especially after experiencing the long-term challenges of previous conflicts. And this has led to a greater emphasis on avoiding unnecessary risks, focusing on diplomatic solutions, and considering the long-term impact of any decision. Which means that even strong alliances like NATO are adapting to a changing global environment where decisions are more complex and less automatic than in the past.
Absolutely. And when we bring all these factors together, including the defensive nature of NATO, the absence of a direct attack, the fear of escalation, and the differences in political priorities, we begin to see a clear explanation for why NATO is not fully engaging in this conflict. Because it is not a simple matter of support or opposition, but a careful and calculated decision based on multiple considerations. And this understanding helps us move beyond simple headlines and see the deeper logic behind these actions.
And this is exactly why this topic is so important for our listeners, because it shows that global decisions are rarely simple and that even close allies may choose different paths when faced with complex situations. And by understanding these reasons, we can better analyze global events, ask more meaningful questions, and develop a clearer perspective on how international relations work in the modern world, which is the goal of this entire discussion as we continue to explore the topic further.
Now that we understand why NATO as an alliance is not fully engaging, it becomes even more important to focus on the European perspective specifically, because countries like Germany and France are playing a key role in shaping the overall response. And what we see from these countries is not a lack of concern about the situation, but a very careful and strategic approach that prioritizes stability over immediate military action. And in recent statements, European leaders have clearly shown that they prefer diplomacy, dialogue, and de-escalation rather than entering a direct conflict, especially in a region where past wars have created long-term instability and unpredictable consequences.
Yes, Adam. And this cautious approach is not just based on political philosophy, but also on real and practical concerns, because Europe has strong economic connections with the Middle East, including trade routes, energy supplies, and long-term investments, and any major conflict involving Iran could seriously disrupt these connections, affecting industries, increasing costs, and creating economic pressure across European countries. And recent developments have already shown how sensitive this situation is, as energy prices have increased due to tensions in key shipping routes, forcing European leaders to focus more on economic stability rather than military involvement.
Exactly, Julia. And this economic factor plays a very powerful role in decision-making. Because when governments consider joining a conflict, they must also consider how it will affect their own economies, their industries, and the daily lives of their citizens. And in the case of Europe, many countries are already dealing with economic challenges, which makes them even more cautious about taking actions that could increase instability. And this is why, instead of supporting military operations, they are focusing on alternative strategies such as sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and international cooperation to manage the situation without escalating it further.
And beyond economics, Adam, there is also a very serious humanitarian concern that European countries are thinking about, which is the possibility of a new refugee crisis, because conflicts in the Middle East have historically led to large movements of people seeking safety, and Europe has already experienced the social, political, and economic challenges that come with sudden increases in refugee populations. And leaders are aware that a larger war involving Iran could create another wave of displacement, putting pressure on resources, infrastructure, and political systems, which is why they are trying to avoid actions that could make the situation worse.
Yes, Julia, and this fear of instability goes beyond just refugees, because a wider conflict could affect the entire region, creating uncertainty in neighboring countries, increasing security risks, and making it more difficult to maintain peace and order. And European leaders understand that once a conflict begins to expand, it becomes much harder to control, which is why they are strongly emphasizing the need to prevent escalation before it reaches that point. And this approach reflects a long-term perspective that prioritizes prevention over reaction.
I completely agree, and we can clearly see this approach in the way European countries are responding to recent events, because instead of sending military forces, they are calling for restraint, urging all sides to reduce tensions, and supporting international efforts to find diplomatic solutions. And, for example, several European nations have issued joint statements condemning escalation, while also emphasizing the importance of maintaining global stability and protecting international trade routes, showing that their focus is on managing the situation rather than intensifying it.
And this brings us to another important point, which is that Europe still recognizes the risks associated with Iran's actions and policies, but it believes that these challenges should be addressed through negotiation rather than war, because military solutions may provide short-term results, but often create long-term problems, especially in complex geopolitical environments. And this belief has led countries like Germany and France to consistently support diplomatic engagement, even in difficult situations, as they see it as the most sustainable way to achieve stability and security.
And it is also important to understand, Adam, that Europe's position does not mean complete inaction, because these countries are still involved in the situation through political pressure, economic measures, and international cooperation. But they are choosing methods that reduce the risk of direct conflict. And this balanced approach allows them to respond to the situation while still maintaining their commitment to peace and stability, which is a key principle in their foreign policy.
Absolutely. And when we look at all these factors together, including economic interests, humanitarian concerns, fear of escalation, and commitment to diplomacy, we begin to see a clear and logical explanation for Europe's cautious stance, because it is not simply about refusing to act, but about choosing a different kind of action, one that focuses on long-term outcomes rather than immediate military involvement. And this perspective helps us understand why there is a difference between the approach of the United States and that of many European countries.
And this difference is exactly what makes this topic so important and interesting, because it shows how even close allies can respond in different ways to the same situation, based on their own experiences, priorities, and strategic thinking. And as we continue our discussion, we will explore how these differences are shaping the future of global alliances and what they mean for international cooperation in an increasingly complex world.
When we look at the current tensions involving Iran and the United States, one of the most serious concerns is not just the conflict itself, but the possibility that it could grow into something much larger. Because history has shown us that regional conflicts in the Middle East rarely remain limited, and instead, they often expand as other countries become involved, either directly through military action or indirectly through political and strategic support, which creates a situation where a single confrontation can quickly turn into a complex and multi-layered crisis affecting many parts of the world.
Yes, Adam. And one of the main reasons for this risk is the presence of multiple regional powers in the Middle East, each with its own interests, alliances, and security concerns. And when tensions rise between major actors, other countries may feel the need to respond in order to protect their own positions, which increases the chances of a wider conflict. And this interconnected system of alliances and rivalries means that even a limited military action could trigger reactions from different sides, making the situation more unpredictable and more difficult to control.
Exactly, Julia, and this is why experts often warn that escalation is not always a planned process, but sometimes an unintended result of actions and reactions. Because when one side takes a step, the other side responds, and this cycle can continue until the situation goes beyond the control of the original decision-makers. And in a region where tensions are already high, the margin for error becomes very small, increasing the risk that a local conflict could develop into a broader war involving multiple countries.
And beyond the military dimension, Adam, there is also a critical economic factor that makes this situation even more sensitive, which is the importance of global energy routes, especially the Strait of Hormuz, because this narrow passage is one of the most important channels for oil transportation in the world, with a large percentage of global energy supplies passing through it every day, and any disruption in this area, whether due to military activity or security concerns, can have immediate and significant effects on global markets.
That is absolutely right, Julia, because when we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, we are not just talking about a geographical location, but about a key point in the global energy system. And if tensions lead to restrictions, attacks, or instability in this route, it could reduce the flow of oil to international markets, causing prices to rise rapidly. And this increase would not only affect governments and industries, but also ordinary people around the world, as higher energy costs lead to increased prices for transportation, goods, and services.
And this connection between conflict and the global economy is one of the reasons why countries far from the Middle East are also paying close attention to the situation. Because even if they are not directly involved in the conflict, they can still feel its impact through economic channels. And recent developments have already shown how quickly markets react to uncertainty, with energy prices increasing and financial markets becoming more volatile whenever tensions rise.
Yes, Julia, and this economic impact is closely linked to global stability. Because when prices rise and markets become uncertain, it can create pressure on governments, businesses, and individuals, leading to broader economic challenges. And this is why many countries are trying to avoid actions that could make the situation worse, as they understand that the consequences of escalation are not limited to the battlefield, but extend into every part of the global system.
And this is exactly where the position of NATO becomes very clear, because the alliance is not only concerned about military risks, but also about the wider consequences of any conflict. And its members understand that entering a war without clear limits could lead to long-term instability, economic disruption, and increased security challenges, which is why they are focusing on preventing escalation rather than responding to it after it happens.
Absolutely, Julia. And this focus on prevention is based on lessons learned from previous conflicts, where initial actions often led to longer and more complex engagements than expected. And in many cases, the costs of these conflicts were much higher than anticipated, both in terms of resources and human impact. And this experience has made many countries more cautious, encouraging them to carefully evaluate risks before making decisions.
I agree, Adam. And it is also important to note that avoiding escalation does not mean ignoring the situation, but rather managing it in a way that reduces risks and creates opportunities for dialogue. Because once a conflict grows beyond a certain point, it becomes much harder to control, and the chances of finding a peaceful solution become smaller, which is why early prevention is often seen as the most effective strategy.
Yes, Julia, and when we bring all these factors together, including the risk of regional involvement, the importance of energy routes, and the impact on the global economy, we can clearly see why this situation is considered so dangerous and why many countries are choosing a cautious approach, because the potential consequences of a larger war are simply too significant to ignore.
And this understanding helps us answer an important part of our main question. Because when we ask why NATO and its members are hesitant to join the conflict, the answer becomes clearer, as we see that their decisions are not based on a lack of support, but on a deep awareness of the risks involved and a strong desire to prevent a situation that could affect not only one region, but the entire world.
As we continue our exploration of why NATO has not fully joined the conflict involving Iran, it is essential to examine whether the alliance is experiencing internal divisions. Because while NATO is often portrayed as a united military front, the reality is more complex, especially in modern conflicts, where national priorities, historical experiences, and strategic interests can differ widely among members. And in this particular case, these differences are becoming more visible, as the United States, under Donald Trump, has taken a more aggressive stance, while many European allies prefer caution and diplomacy.
Yes, Adam, and this difference in approach highlights the gap between the United States and its European partners, because the US strategy emphasizes direct action, maximum pressure, and clear threats of military force, whereas countries like Germany, France, and Italy prioritize negotiations, regional stability, and avoiding escalation. And this divergence does not indicate a collapse of the alliance, but it does reveal that NATO members often approach situations with different assumptions and priorities, reflecting the unique political and social contexts within each country.
Exactly, Julia, and when we look at the history of NATO, we see that disagreements among members are not new, because alliances often face moments of tension when national interests clash with collective decisions. But the Iran situation shows how modern geopolitical realities, such as economic interdependence, energy security, and regional instability, can magnify these differences, creating public debates and diplomatic discussions about the best course of action, which in turn challenges the perception of NATO as a perfectly unified entity.
And this internal complexity is further compounded by political considerations within each country. Adam, because leaders must balance international commitments with domestic priorities. And in Europe, public opinion often favors diplomacy over war, especially in regions already affected by conflicts. And governments must respond to these domestic pressures when deciding whether to support military action, which sometimes leads to cautious policies that may seem hesitant from an external perspective, but are carefully calculated internally.
Yes, Julia, and another important aspect is that NATO's structure itself allows for flexibility, which is both a strength and a potential source of disagreement. Because while Article 5 obligates collective defense only in the case of a direct attack on a member state, other decisions, including participation in non-member conflicts, are largely optional, giving each country the freedom to act according to its own judgment. Which is why we see a variety of approaches among allies, with some supporting sanctions or political measures and others avoiding any military involvement.
And this optional participation is one of the key reasons why some analysts question NATO's unity in modern conflicts, Adam. Because while the alliance is strong in principle, Real-world situations often require nuanced responses that do not fit neatly into a single strategy. And in crises like the current tension with Iran, the alliance must navigate a landscape where interests, capabilities, and threat perceptions differ significantly, creating debates about priorities, responsibilities, and the limits of collective action.
Exactly, Julia. And this situation also illustrates how alliances must adapt to changing global dynamics, because the Middle East today is far more interconnected than in the past, with energy markets, trade routes, and international partnerships all influencing decisions. And NATO members are aware that any military engagement in the region could have ripple effects far beyond the immediate conflict, which naturally encourages caution, negotiation, and consensus building rather than rapid deployment.
And this cautious approach, Adam, sometimes gives the appearance of division, but it also reflects a more sophisticated understanding of modern warfare and international relations, because today's conflicts are rarely simple or isolated, and countries must consider not only military success, but also economic impact, public perception, regional stability, and long-term consequences, which can lead to disagreements about the best way to proceed, even among close allies.
Yes, Julia, and one area where disagreement is especially clear is in the assessment of risk, because the U.S. may perceive a direct threat that requires immediate pressure, while European countries may view the same situation as manageable through diplomacy and sanctions. And these differing risk assessments affect decision-making, as leaders weigh potential gains against potential costs, and this can result in contrasting policies and public statements, which contribute to the perception of a divided alliance.
And it is also worth noting, Adam, that these differences are not limited to Iran, because NATO has faced similar internal disagreements in other conflicts, such as interventions in Libya, Afghanistan, and Syria, where the US and European allies sometimes pursued different strategies based on their own capabilities, political considerations, and historical experiences, demonstrating that NATO's unity is often tested in complex crises that go beyond collective defense scenarios.
Exactly, Julia, and this brings us to a broader point about changing global alliances, because today, countries are forming partnerships and coalitions in ways that are more fluid and situation-specific, rather than relying solely on permanent blocs. And this means that NATO members must constantly negotiate their common goals while respecting individual priorities, which can create tension, but also allows for more flexible responses to rapidly changing threats and geopolitical landscapes.
Yes, Adam. And in the case of Iran, we can see how this flexibility is playing out, because NATO as a whole has not committed to military action, but individual members are still involved diplomatically, economically, and politically, showing that the alliance can maintain cohesion while allowing for diversity in response, which is essential in a complex and unpredictable environment.
And this diversity of approach, Julia, is not necessarily a weakness, but rather a reflection of the modern world, where no single strategy fits all situations, and where alliances must balance collective security with national interests, economic concerns, and public opinion. And in this context, the current Iran conflict serves as a clear example of how NATO must navigate differences to maintain its relevance, credibility, and effectiveness in the 21st century.
Finally, Adam, understanding these internal disagreements helps our listeners see that NATO's apparent division is a natural outcome of complex modern diplomacy, because the alliance is responding to a multifaceted conflict where military action, economic pressures, regional stability, and global consequences are all interconnected. And by recognizing these challenges, we can better appreciate why decisions take time, why caution often prevails, and why NATO continues to adapt to an increasingly complex global environment.
As we move deeper into this discussion, Julia, it becomes clear that the hesitation of NATO and the differences among its members are not just about a single conflict, but also about the larger picture of global power, because we are witnessing a shift in international relations where traditional alliances are being tested and countries are increasingly pursuing independent strategies based on their own interests, priorities, and assessments of risk. And this trend reflects a world where collective action is no longer automatic, and where the decisions of one nation can have ripple effects across multiple regions.
Absolutely, Adam. And one of the most striking aspects of this shift is how rising powers like China and Russia are influencing global dynamics, because these countries are expanding their economic, political, and military reach in ways that directly affect how traditional alliances operate. And for example, China's growing influence in trade and infrastructure projects, along with Russia's strategic interventions in regional conflicts, create new variables that NATO and its members must consider when forming their policies, which in turn can complicate decisions about how and when to act collectively.
Exactly, Julia. And this development is leading to a more multipolar world, where power is distributed among a wider range of actors, rather than being concentrated in a single dominant country or alliance. And in such a context, alliances like NATO must adapt to changing realities, because the old model of unified automatic responses may not always be feasible or even desirable. And countries now have to weigh the benefits of coordinated action against the flexibility of pursuing independent strategies that align with national interests.
Yes, Adam. And another consequence of this evolving power balance is that diplomacy is becoming increasingly central to international relations, because military force alone is rarely sufficient to manage complex global issues, especially when multiple actors with competing interests are involved. And today, countries must combine political negotiation, economic tools, and strategic signaling to influence outcomes without escalating conflicts unnecessarily, which is why we see so much emphasis on talks, multilateral discussions, and international pressure in situations like the current Iran conflict.
And Julia, this focus on diplomacy also reflects the understanding that in modern conflicts, the cost of war can extend far beyond the battlefield, impacting energy markets, trade, regional stability, and even domestic politics in multiple countries. And as a result, nations are more cautious about committing to military action unless it is absolutely necessary, preferring to use a combination of sanctions, negotiations, and strategic positioning to achieve their goals, which demonstrates how power in the 21st century is exercised in multiple dimensions simultaneously.
Exactly, Adam. And this is where the role of perception and signaling becomes very important, because countries are not only responding to immediate threats, but also to how their actions are interpreted by allies, rivals, and global markets, and maintaining credibility, influence, and strategic advantage often requires careful balancing, where showing restraint can be as powerful as taking action, and where the ability to coordinate with partners while preserving national autonomy becomes a key skill in international relations.
Yes, Julia, and in this context, NATO's cautious approach to Iran can be seen as part of a broader adaptation to the changing global order, because the alliance is learning to navigate a world in which threats are complex, interconnected, and often unpredictable, and where decisions must consider not only immediate security concerns, but also economic implications, regional stability, and the broader balance of power, which is increasingly influenced by non-Western actors like China and Russia.
And Adam, this also highlights that global power is no longer solely measured by military strength, because economic influence, technological capability, and soft power have become equally critical. And nations like China leverage their economic ties to gain strategic advantages, while Russia projects power through military interventions and political alliances, creating a landscape in which traditional definitions of power are evolving, and alliances like NATO must adjust to maintain their relevance and effectiveness.
Exactly, Julia. And this evolution of power underscores the importance of flexibility in foreign policy, because countries must now balance multiple objectives, including national security, economic stability, diplomatic influence, and public perception. And this requires a sophisticated understanding of the international system, as well as the ability to respond to crises in ways that minimize risk and maximize strategic advantage, even when complete consensus among allies is not possible.
Exactly, Adam. And this approach also encourages long-term thinking, because nations understand that conflicts like the one involving Iran can have consequences that last decades. affecting not only bilateral relations but the broader international order, and by prioritizing diplomacy and strategic influence over immediate confrontation, countries aim to preserve stability, protect interests, and maintain credibility in an increasingly complex and multipolar world.
And when we consider all of these factors together, Julia, it becomes clear that the current situation is not just a regional issue, but a reflection of larger shifts in global power, where alliances, rising powers, and independent strategies interact in ways that challenge old assumptions, and where the ability to manage conflicts effectively requires coordination, foresight, and a deep understanding of the multiple dimensions of influence that define modern international relations.
Finally, Adam, this broader perspective helps us see why NATO's cautious stance, the differing approaches of European and American allies, and the growing role of countries like China and Russia all matter, because they are part of a larger transformation in how global power is exercised, negotiated, and maintained. And by following these dynamics closely, we can better understand not only the current conflict with Iran, but also the evolving landscape of international relations in the 21st century, where diplomacy, strategy, and influence are more interconnected than ever before.
As we bring this discussion to a close, Julia, it is essential to reflect on the lessons we can draw from the current situation, because the Iran conflict has made one thing very clear. Alliances, no matter how strong or long-standing, have their limits, and even the most powerful countries cannot assume automatic support from their partners in every scenario. And when we analyze NATO's hesitation, the differences between the United States and European members, and the broader global response, it becomes evident that decisions are rarely straightforward, and that strategy, national interests, and risk assessment play decisive roles in shaping actions, which reminds us that international politics is far more complex than simple unity or division.
Absolutely, Adam. And this complexity is one of the most important points for our listeners to understand, because the world is not a place of predictable reactions, but a network of interdependent actors, each with its own priorities, constraints, and calculations. And while alliances like NATO provide frameworks for cooperation and collective defense, they cannot eliminate the influence of individual national interests or the impact of regional and global dynamics, which means that leaders must constantly weigh their options, anticipate reactions, and carefully consider the consequences of every decision.
Exactly, Julia. And another lesson we can draw is that not every conflict automatically generates unity, even among traditional allies, because unity is conditional on shared threat perception, compatible objectives, and the political will to act. And when these elements are not aligned, as we saw in the differing approaches to Iran, the alliance may act cautiously, selectively, or not at all. And this does not indicate weakness, but rather a pragmatic recognition of limits, a calculation of potential costs, and an awareness of the unpredictable nature of modern conflicts, which often involve multiple dimensions, including military risk, economic impact, and geopolitical consequences.
Yes, Adam. And we also see clearly that strategy and national interests are central to understanding these decisions, because the US approach under Donald Trump emphasizes pressure, leverage, and decisive action, while European allies like Germany and France prioritize negotiation, stability, and minimizing escalation. And both approaches are shaped not only by security calculations, but by domestic politics, public opinion, and economic considerations, which shows that strategy cannot be divorced from context, and that even powerful nations must adapt their actions to the realities they face.
And this adaptation is crucial, Julia, because in today's interconnected world, no leader or country can act in isolation without consequences. And as we explored in previous sections, actions taken in one region can create ripple effects across global markets, energy supplies, regional stability, and international alliances. And this reality reinforces the importance of careful planning, coordinated diplomacy, and risk assessment, because decisions that ignore these factors can quickly escalate into unintended crises with far-reaching implications for both allies and adversaries.
Absolutely, Adam. And it is also a reminder that global complexity is not merely theoretical, but practical, because the interactions among countries, alliances, rising powers, and economic systems create a web of interdependencies that makes each decision both significant and potentially unpredictable. And understanding this complexity is essential not only for policymakers, but also for citizens, students, and anyone who wants to follow international news with insight and clarity, because the world is increasingly defined by networks of influence rather than by unilateral action.
Yes, Julia. And when we consider NATO's role, the caution of European countries, and the calculated approach of the United States, we can see that leadership today is as much about strategy and balance as it is about power, because a nation may have military might, economic resources, or historical influence, but without careful planning, diplomatic engagement, and coalition building, even the strongest actions can fail to achieve their objectives, and may in fact create additional risks. Which is why understanding the limits of leadership is just as important as understanding the potential of strength.
Exactly, Adam. And this also highlights the importance of recognizing that global challenges are rarely simple or one-dimensional, because conflicts involve not only military threats, but also economic, social, and political dimensions. And the interactions between these factors often determine whether a conflict escalates or is managed successfully. And as we've seen, careful diplomacy, risk mitigation, and multilateral engagement are essential tools for addressing these complex problems effectively.
Yes, Julia, and one more key takeaway is that global power is evolving, because it is no longer defined solely by brute force or unilateral action, but by the ability to coordinate, influence, and manage relationships in a complex international system. And in this context, alliances are tools rather than guarantees. Strategies matter more than assumptions, and foresight and balance often outweigh immediate action, which is a crucial lesson for understanding why NATO, European countries, and the United States have approached the Iran conflict with such careful deliberation.
And Adam, this also reminds us that for students and observers of international relations, it is vital to appreciate nuance, to follow multiple perspectives, and to recognize the interplay between national priorities and global considerations. Because only by seeing the full picture can we understand why leaders make the choices they do, why alliances operate the way they do, and why the international system requires both cooperation and independent strategic thinking to maintain stability in a complex world.
Yes, Julia, and in conclusion, what we see from this analysis is that leadership alone is not enough in modern international affairs, because even the most influential leaders cannot assume automatic support from allies, cannot ignore the consequences of escalation, and cannot act without considering the interdependent nature of global systems. And therefore, effective leadership requires not only strength, but strategy, foresight, and the ability to work with others in ways that balance competing interests and manage risk across multiple dimensions.
Exactly, Adam. And this understanding also provides a lens through which we can interpret other global events. Because whether it is conflicts, trade disputes, or diplomatic negotiations, the same principles apply. Alliances have limits, interests shape decisions, and careful consideration is required to navigate a world where power is distributed, complex, and interconnected.
And finally, Julia, as we think about the lessons from NATO's response, European caution, and the U.S. approach to Iran, it is clear that the future of global leadership will depend not just on military might or economic influence, but on strategic balance, careful coalition building, and the capacity to cooperate across borders, which ensures that decisions are not only strong but sustainable and effective in a rapidly changing world.
And with that in mind, Adam, we leave our listeners with this final thought, because it captures the essence of everything we've discussed today. In today's world, even the strongest leaders cannot act alone, because global power is no longer about strength, but about strategy, balance, and cooperation.